Hello and welcome to the Oxford University Museum of Natural History for tonight's Drawn to Nature event. I'm Laura Ashby and I'm the events manager here at the museum. And for those of you who are who regularly join our events, you may be surprised not to see Chris introducing. Well, we're very lucky today to have Chris actually presenting. So he'll be giving tonight's talk about birds. So you won't be without his dulcet tones for too long. But before we make a start, I'll just give you a couple of bits of housekeeping. So if at any point your signal drops out during the event, just click on the red reconnect button at the top. That usually does the job. And if we drop out for any reason at our side, we'll rejoin as quickly as we can. You've all been introducing yourselves down in the chat bar, and please do, if you haven't said hello already. It's really lovely always to see where you're joining us from and to see some familiar names popping up and to also see some new people joining. So welcome anybody who hasn't joined one of these events before. If you have any questions during Chris's talk or anything you'd like to ask him, pop those in the chat as well, and we'll try and get through as many of those towards the end of the event as we can as well. To just give you a bit of an idea about what the format of tonight's event, it's not really a formal lecture. Chris will give us a talk, an introduction to birds. And then after that, you have a bit of an opportunity to sketch some of our specimens. So we'll give you a couple of quick 2-minute sketches just to kind of get your eye in, get your pencil or your paintbrush in. And then there'll be a 4-minute, a 6-minute, that's not right, a 6-minute and a 10-minute sketch, and then a 15-minute sketch, and we'll ask your questions over the top of that as well. So we've got lots of gorgeous specimens for you to draw this evening. And we've got a really very interesting introduction coming from Chris. So for those of you who don't know Chris, and he doesn't tend to give a big description of his job here when he introduces, so I'll introduce him a bit more formally now. So Chris is our primary school education officer here at the museum. So he looks after all the primary school visits that come in, but he also has another role here. He programs our adult events. So if you've been to the museum for a late night evening spectacular, or if you've joined us for one of our lectures online, or even these Drawn to Nature events, these are all the brainchild of Chris, and he comes up with all sorts of fantastic formats and really interesting ways of engaging with our specimens, engaging with the stories behind the museum. So we're really excited that Chris is going to be talking tonight, and I think it's probably about time that we met him. So Chris, are you with us?
Hello, Laura. Yes, I am. I'm here. I'm in the hot seat for a change. So all of those times I've had other members of staff who said, just give us a 20-minute talk, would you? And just share your screen there. I'm now having to do the same thing. So bear with me, because it's not as easy as I've often assumed. Let me share my talk with you. And let's go back to the beginning. And I get a chance to talk to you about one of my favourite subjects, which is birds, which I think are one of the most fascinating and diverse groups of animals on the planet, both in terms of their evolutionary history, their anatomy, their behaviour, their diversity. I mean, they're just marvellous. So I thought I'd start off with a little bit on their evolution. So where do birds come from? Well, I mean, the first feathery animals we know of are obviously the dinosaurs, and it was in 1860, the year that this museum was built, and the year the great debate, the first ever debate on Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection, took place in this museum, that the first fossil of a feathered flying dinosaur was found. And this is the dinosaur Archaeopteryx. And it was T.H. Huxley who defended Darwin in that debate, who actually proposed that due to its skeleton and its similarities with dinosaurs and birds were more closely related than dinosaurs were to lizards. He then went on to propose that other dinosaurs like Compsognathus, another small 3-toed theropod dinosaur, was feathered as well. This was strongly opposed by Darwin's opponent, Richard Owen, who was the guy who came up with the word dinosaur, and the idea of sort of feathery dinosaurs sort of fell out of favour for the next 100 years. And it wasn't until about 1969 that a guy called John Ostrom in the States started to propose this idea again, and even produce some beautiful illustrations of some feathery dinosaurs. But there wasn't a huge amount of evidence, and it wasn't until the 1990s when in Liaoning in China, a whole range of feathery dinosaurs from across a range of dinosaur groups started to appear. And many of these dinosaurs were not the classic three-toed things. Even more recently, in 2019, the dinosaur you can see, that the animal you can see in the middle of your screen, a pterosaur, was discovered. An anurognathed pterosaur was discovered, a little small thing, whereas the scientists studying it showed that it had a variety of different feather-like structures. And this is particularly interesting because dinosaurs and pterosaurs, they split from a common ancestor right at the beginning of the Triassic. And this suggested that if pterosaurs were feathery and dinosaurs were feathery, perhaps even the ancestors of dinosaurs had feathers, which would mean most dinosaurs were feathery. But this is still incredibly controversial. And if you want to start a really good argument with paleontologists, just walk into a room full of them and say, do you think all dinosaurs were feathery? And they'll be at it for hours. So we don't know exactly when dinosaurs evolved feathers, but we certainly know they had evolved them. And we do know how dinosaurs evolved feathers, which means that, your average feathery dinosaur, your baby T-Rexes actually might have looked like this. And I have to apologize, I've had to throw in a few of my own illustrations here, not as good as some of the beautiful works you've been sharing on Twitter. But this is my interpretation of a little nest of duckling-like toothy T-Rexes. So we know, many dinosaurs might have been feathered. Obviously, as they grew up, they wouldn't have been quite so cute as this BBC representation of an adult T-Rex shows us. So dinosaurs, many of them were feathery. So how did these feathers evolve? Well, this diagram from Richard Prum shows us how feathers might have evolved. Now, all vertebrates have a protein in their skin cells called keratin, and this can form hair, nails, horns, feathers, and scales. And he proposed that these little cells within the skin, placoids, thicken locally and produce this keratin-like scale. Now, that might give rise to one that points out, which might give rise to a variety through natural mutation to something a bit raggedy and a bit fluffy. Now, that would give dinosaurs an advantage in regulating their temperature and keeping themselves warm, so nature would have selected for that. That would then go on to evolve into a more, finely branched structure, and then evolve into an even more complicatedly branched structure. So, we can see how, feathery scales might actually, sort of fluffy things might keep a baby T-Rex warm. That's an advantage. But how do they evolve into something that's a bit more flamboyant? Well, sorry about the illustrations again. We can see how, obviously, thermoregulation is an evolutionary advantage, a survival advantage. So, the first dinosaurs with feathers might have had these proto-fluffy feathers that kept them warm. And, if they cost a lot of energy to invest in to produce, and they're a survival benefit, females might actually start to select for them. They might actually start to use them to judge the fitness of their mates until you get the evolution of really showy feathers, and you end up with display feathers like this. Great big sexy feathers, crests, or feathers on arms or tails. That are evolved just because females have always been selecting those males that produce the most energetically costly feathers to produce. So how do you get from display to flight? Well, there are three two main theories, and one which I like, which is a bit quirky. We know these dinosaurs had, many of them had display feathers, and there are some recent discoveries that show this. Things like the two dinosaurs you see on one side of your screen, Sinosauropteryx, the scientists that discovered these have produced this illustration that shows them dancing, and they propose they use these for displays. The dinosaur in the middle of your screen, Anchiornis huxleyi, with a bright red comb of feathers. Now, that looks like something that would only be used for display. Even more convincingly, this dinosaur on the far right of your screen, Epideptrix, has these four ginger and black stripy tail feathers. Now, there's no special function for them apart from display. Even better than that, because there is a new technique for looking at the color of feathers by looking at the fossil structures on feathers. The dinosaur at the bottom of your screen, Kai Hong, this rather wonderful illustration shows us what it might have looked like. The structures on its feathers actually show that it might have had iridescent feathers. It might have sparkled a bit like a starling does today. So great, we've got the evolution of down feathers, warm feathers, and the government goes on to feathers for sexual selection. But how do you get to flight? Well, there's three main theories, as I said. The first one is the ground up theory. So the idea is the ground is not level, it goes up and down, and any dinosaur that can use its display feathers on its arms, can use them to sort of glide a little bit, can save energy by gliding over these divots in the ground to catch a prey or escape from enemies. And there is some evidence for this from birds today. The picture of the pigeons running up that ladder there are doing something called flap running, which many birds actually do. And this paper in the Journal of Experimental Biology showed that by flap running, not actually using their feathers for flying, but flapping them as they scramble up and over objects, uses about 10% less of the energy that the bird would need for flying or for just climbing on its own. So perhaps ground up is one way they evolved flight. The other big evolutionary argument is that it was tree down that led to flight. So, maybe perhaps these dinosaurs with feathers on their wings jumped out of trees, and glided. And there is lots of evidence for this today in animals we see around us. So in the world today, we have things like gliding squirrels, gliding marsupials, we have gliding lizards, we have gliding ants. There's even a species of gliding snake in Southeast Asia that flattens its body and glides from tree to tree to move around. But the only evidence we have of this method of evolving flight, for evolving powered flight, is in today's bats and the extinct pterosaurs. And these obviously used skin to fly, as all of these animals are doing. They're using the outsides of their bodies rather than wings. But my favourite theory, and this is probably the least accepted and the quirkiest, is why not, instead of ground up or tree down, why not ground up and down? Now, the idea behind this is, imagine you're a dinosaur, a small dinosaur the size of a turkey, and you're living in long grass that comes up to your nose. And you have beautiful display feathers on your arms, and you need to show them off to attract a female. So what can you do? Well, you could wave them above your head and go, "Hey, baby, look at this." And you would be seen from a little way away. But if you want to be seen from a long way away, you could jump and wave your feathers about. And this is what some birds do today. The top right-hand side of your screen, you can see a picture of a bird called a long-tailed widow bird. These live in Africa in long grass, and they do exactly that. They display by jumping and flapping. At the bottom of the screen, you've got a little bustard there. Again, it does the same thing, but the best is that bird in the middle, the lesser florican. And if you want to see a beautiful display, an example of how this might work, do you go onto YouTube and look up lesser florican display, because they're spectacular when they're displays. But you can imagine how any dinosaur with a variety of feather that could stay up in the air that little bit longer than any of the others may be judged to be more sexually fit as a partner by female dinosaurs, and so it might breed more often and have more babies. Any of their babies with feathers that kept them up in the air that little bit longer, they would be selected for, and on and on and on, until you end up with an animal like Archaeopteryx, this first dinosaur with feathers to fly that was discovered in 1860. There are very few of these specimens known. In fact, one is only known by this one single feather, but that feather is incredibly important because it shows us it's a flight feather. The front leading edge of its feather is shorter than the back edge, and this is how birds change the pressure going over their wings and generate lift so they could fly. So how well could it fly? Well, there's a nice paper in the 1970s by D.W. Yalden that looked at all sorts of different birds' wings and the proportions of them, that suggested that it could do something that magpies and pheasants do today. It could do something called wing-in-ground flying. So it could swoop low over the ground and use the updraft and the change in pressure to actually continue its flight and glide for quite a long distance, which is possibly a good bit of evidence for the ground-up theory of the evolution of flight. Now, it's not until about 133 million years ago that we get something a little bit more birdy in the fossil record, and these are a group of birds, or dinosaurs, flying dinosaurs, called the Ornithurans, and these are discovered in a beautiful, amazing state of preservation in the Jehol Formation in China. They're looking a bit more like birds. There's about 80 species of these known, but they're still quite dinosaur-like. They've still got teeth, quite chunky ones in the case of Longipteryx there. They've still got quite long bony tails, and they've still got claws on their front limbs, all things that the birds lost. But these aren't the direct ancestors of our birds. These birds actually went extinct at the same time as the dinosaurs. They filled all sorts of niches, from fish eaters to plant eaters to insect eaters. Actually, at the same time, though, there was another small group of birds that had evolved, or dinosaurs, whatever you want to call them, and these are the Ornithurans. And probably the best known example is Ichthyornis. Now, this has some more bird-like features. It has reduced teeth. It's missing those claws on its front limbs, and its tailbone has shortened and fused into a thing birds have today, a thing called a pygostyle, which enables greater control of its tail feathers, greater steering and maneuverability in flight. Now, the long bony tails, the teeth, the claws, these are all heavy, and nature selected to lose these because obviously any animal that's flying, the less it weighs, the more efficient it is, the less food it eats. This also had the beginnings of the first beaks, and beaks were an incredibly important evolutionary step change that enabled dinosaurs to lose their claws, lose their long bony tails, and lose their teeth, as well as what's inside their mouth, and I'll get onto that in a little bit. Something else evolved around this time, and this amazing fossil was discovered in 2016, or its paper was published in 2016. This is an animal called Vagavis that was around about 66 million years ago, and its fossil was so well preserved that inside its throat it had the first example of a syrinx. Now, whereas we only have one voice box, birds basically have two. They have this organ, the syrinx. So they have two different sound-producing organs, just where their bronchi, the tubes to their lungs, meet their trachea, which means they can sing from one, the other, or both at the same time, meaning they can sing in harmony with themselves. They can sing a chord. And this makes me wonder, what was the soundscape at the end of the time of the dinosaurs? Were they surrounded by birdsong? Were some dinosaurs themselves singing? There's no evidence that dinosaurs had a syrinx, but who knows what waits to be discovered. And then, obviously, 66 million years ago, bang, a huge meteorite hits the Earth, and 70% of all vertebrate life is wiped out. Pretty much everything over 500 grams disappears, including the pterosaurs and the larger dinosaurs. But some of the very few survivors were these Ornithurans, this group that gave rise to our birds. And today we have over 10,000 species, about 10,500 species of bird, ranging in diversity from things the size of an ostrich to things the size of a bee, in the case of the bee hummingbird. And they live all over the world, on every continent. They're an incredibly diverse and successful group. So I thought we'd look at some of the adaptations that make them so successful a group. And the first adaptation is the beak. Now, when you think about beaks, people obviously think about them as sort of horny, hard, naily-like things, but nothing could be further from the truth. Birds, by the time of the end of the dinosaurs, had begun to evolve to lose their teeth and lose their claws, and the beak is actually their substitute for it. They're incredibly sensitive organs. On this picture of the skull, we can see these little pits, which are there for blood vessels and nerves to reach tiny little sense organs called Herbst and granary corpuscles. Now, these enable the bird to sense movement and pressure with their beak, which and they're distributed in various positions on different birds according to how they use their beaks. So things like ducks, how do they sieve all of that mud for their food? Well, these Herbst and granary corpuscles allow them to sense the difference between food particles and mud and grit, so they don't just swallow loads of muck. Things like kiwis, they have this enormously long beak with loads of these little sense organs at the end, at the tip, so they can plunge it into the earth and they can feel the movement of worms nearby by the pressure change and actually suck them up. And of course, you need beaks to do the amazing thing of nest building if you don't have hands, if you've lost those. So things like weaver birds have this incredible dexterity, and they can knit together these amazing nests made of grass. And then probably the best and most dexterous use of a beak, I think, is the tailor bird, that bird in those leaves there. They collect spider silk from webs, which they use to sew leaves together, in which they'll build their nest. And beaks are also used for another function. They're there to lose heat. They're radiators. If you're covered in feathers, it's like wearing several duvets. You need to be able to get rid of heat. And of course, you need to lose that heat somehow. And beaks are these radiators, as you can see from this thermal image of a toucan. If you see a duck on a river with its head underneath its wing, it's just keeping warm. It's stopping heat leaving its body. But it's also, that's great. If you've got beak, that's fingers. You can do things with fingers, but what about thumbs? Well, there's another organ that birds have evolved to take care of that job, and that is their tongue. Now, birds' tongues aren't big, muscly, fleshy things like ours. They actually have muscles on the outside, and they're mounted onto these cartilaginous sort of frames that run around the back of their skull that then fit inside mucus-lined sheaths that can slip in and out. So they can extend their tongues really easily. And things like the woodpecker, their tongue is so long it starts growing in the middle of their head. The only way to fit it in, start in the middle of their head and actually go right round the back and then come out, and they can slide these sheaths sort of right out. But then they also have incredible little keratin-like growths that are covered in these sense organs as well. And there's not much known about these sense organs that I could find out on tongues. Things like penguins have these little backward-facing spines for grabbing their prey, grabbing fish and sensing where they are. Hummingbirds have these amazing frayed tongues made of keratin with these the tips with these amazing structures for sucking in nectar. Woodpeckers, they don't use their tongues for spearing grubs. I mean, after all, how do you get it off? Those bony spines at the end, those keratinized spines are covered in these husks and granary corpuscles for wrapping around grubs and then pulling them out. Eagles have backward pointing spines on the back of their tongues for pulling down flesh. Vultures have this buzzsaw-like set of blades almost of keratin on the sides of their tongues for slicing up meat from carcasses. But perhaps the best tongue, I think, is this beautiful lorikeet, this parrot at the bottom, that has a lovely keratinized shaving brush-like organ at the end of its tongue just for dusting off nectar, which is what these things feed upon. So their beak is basically their hand and a substitute for the loss of teeth and the loss of fingers and thumbs as they evolved to fly. Now, we also think about feathers we have birds, and there's a huge variety of feathers there that evolved to do different jobs. There are retrice feathers at the tail end for steering, which are fairly broad. The remige, the wing feathers, which have this short and long edge for generating lift. Contour feathers, which make them aerodynamic and allow the air to sleekly flow over the bird. And then semi-plume and down feathers to keep them warm that are close to the skin and trap air. And then there are a couple of other very important feathers, bristle feathers, which birds like flycatchers and swifts and these other insect-eating birds tend to have around their mouths, around their eyes, which enables them to sense food as it's near their beak and actually funnel it into their mouths. And then probably one of the most underrepresented feathers in the feather league are the phyloplumes. Now, if you've ever plucked a chicken or a turkey, these are the really stubborn little bits you find on the end of them after you've got all the big feathers off. And these are there to sense the position of other feathers. These are sense organs. And keeping your feathers in order is incredibly important for birds. They're always preening them, keeping them in order, looking after them. And these phyloplumes actually are dotted in amongst the other feathers to allow them to sense the position of those other feathers. But they're not as feathery as you think. Imagine having to run a marathon wearing 2 duvets. This is pretty much what it's like flying with a bird. You're incredibly well insulated. So birds actually have large areas of their bodies that are not particularly well feathered, areas called apteria. This diagram shows us where the main spaces are. That means they can insulate themselves and keep very warm by wrapping feathers around them, or they can regulate their heat by fluffing up their feathers and exposing their skin on these apteria and letting heat out. So they're rather wonderful adaptations used in various ways. Eyes are another thing that people underestimate birds for. We talk about birds with beady eyes. Now, possibly that's because birds don't roll their eyes in their heads. Their eyes are fixed with sclerotic bony rings, most birds. So they can't roll them. So they tend to twist their head. Now, another reason they're doing that is to create an image. We have things in our eyes where there's areas where our cells for picking up images, our rod cells and our cone cells are very densely packed, and those are the most sensitive areas of the eye. Us humans, we only have one. Birds have 2. These areas are called fovea, and birds actually have a central fovea and a temporal fovea. Now, those foveas are shaped such that the central fovea gathers light from a 45-degree angle, and these can be used as zoom lenses. Actually, these are shaped so that animals like eagles can actually zoom in on something like a rabbit on a mountainside from 3 miles away. They have zoom lens eyes. The temporal fovea, the other fovea, is used for near vision. And actually, when you see a bird cocking its head to one side, it might be using one eye to look at its food, a small seed on the ground, and its other eye looking a mile in the sky for that very troublesome falcon that's been seen circling overhead. Not only that, but birds don't just see the world we do. Their eyes are even better than that. They don't just have zoom lenses and near sight vision. They actually see colours we can't. Now, we're trichromatic animals. We only see three colours. We see red, blue, and green. Birds are tetrachromatic. They see another wavelength of light. They see ultraviolet light. So the world looks very different. If we look at this puffin's beak underneath ultraviolet light, you can see how it glows, and this might help them to feed their young under the ground in the burrows they nest in. Might help them, recognize each other diving for sand eels late at night. And there's a rather nice, the eggs will look different. There's a rather nice illustration I got off the internet there as well of how a bird might see. So we've got a picture of a starling in the way we see it, with those three wavelengths of light, and then one next to it with the ultraviolet light added in. So when you think of a bird, you're thinking about basically a super animal. These are dinosaurs that can also sing. I've got this rather beautiful animation from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which if you want to know anything about birds is a great site to visit. This shows us how their syrinx works, that organ that was first seen, has first been discovered in Vega 66 million years ago. And it shows us how they can actually produce one sound from one sound from another, or both sounds together. Not only that, but they have super speed hearing. Actually, in the breeding season, the area of birds' brains that processes sounds enlarges by up to a third. The neurons grow and their hearing becomes much more acute. So when we listen to a bird song, actually we're not hearing half of it. If you slow one down or you look at a sonograph, you will see what birds are hearing and the speed they're hearing it at. And this is all to do with growing their brain during the breeding season. Obviously, it's not needed outside of the breeding season, so they can save energy by reducing it again. Also, they have an ability to never go deaf. Now, if you're my age, you're beginning to lose those higher frequency sounds because the little hairs in my inner ear, in my cochlea, the cilia there, are beginning to die off and they'll never regrow. I'll never hear those top notes again. Birds can regrow them every single season. They will never go deaf. So what we have is flying around us are dinosaurs that have evolved super speed hearing, that can enlarge and shrink their brain, that have zoom lens vision, that can see colors that we can't see, that have a feeding organ, a beak that has turned into a hand, that can also sing harmonies with themselves. And that is marvelous. But the sad state of the world is that along with the rest of biodiversity on this planet, birds are really suffering. And in these charts from the IUCN Red List, we can see how almost a quarter of all bird species are now threatened or near threatened. And of those birds, actually, the picture is getting worse. 82% of those species, the populations are still decreasing. And that's a very depressing note to end on. So I would like to end on a little bit of hope. Because last month, I was out in Oxford. I was on my canoe on a River Cherwell, just behind the museum. And I looked up and I saw two of these magnificent birds. The ones with the red caps there, the cranes. Now, these had been missing from England for hundreds of years until a pair in 1970 landed and bred in the east of England. The RSPB saw this and they decided to set up another breeding program in another part of England. And today, because of habitat restoration, we have about 200 pairs of these animals. I was lucky enough just to see two flying over a busy city like Oxford. 2 days later, I went into the Cotswolds with my family to a town called Broadway, and I looked up in the sky and I saw this other bird, a white stork, circling overhead. These have been missing from Britain for 600 years. But 5 years ago, a project called the White Stork Project, a combination of zoos and captive breeding programs, rewilding landholders and conservationists got together to start captive breeding them and releasing them. And because their habitat has been restored in areas, we now have 20 pairs of these birds that visit annually to this country. And last year, the very first pair bred in 600 years in Knepp Castle, down in Suffolk. So we can do something about it. If we rewild, we restore wild habitats, give them room, and we help some of these critically endangered birds, we can actually surround ourselves with these glorious, glorious creatures. And at that point, normally I would thank our speaker, and I would go through the usual smatter. But as there's no one really to thank me, I think I'd better say a great big thank you to myself for this for that wonderful informative talk. So thank you, Chris. I'm really looking forward to your questions and answering your questions later. But it's about time we got on with our first drawing challenge. And rather than music this time round to accompany your drawing, we thought we'd play you a little bit of bird song that was recorded by our colleagues up at the university's Arboretum, the Harcourt Arboretum, last year for International Dawn Chorus Day, which was only 2 days ago this year. And your first 2-minute sketch is this rather wonderful kingfisher. So enjoy drawing it. You have 2 minutes. So I hope you're enjoying drawing this wonderful kingfisher. There's a brilliant version of a painting of one of these by John Ruskin, who was also involved in building this museum. If you want to look that up at some point. But we're coming up to the end of this first sketch, and it's time to move over to your second speed sketch challenge. And this is an arrangement of 3 feathers, 3 display feathers: a peacock, a pheasant, and an ostrich feather. You have 2 minutes just to get your eye in and let your pen wander. So we're just coming to the end of that speed sketch challenge. Don't worry if you didn't finish off. You can obviously revisit these on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, at any time you want to finish things off. But it's time now to move on to our next 6-minute study. And this is a rather beautiful green woodpecker. These are obviously the birds you hear yaffling away in your gardens. There we are. I think we've just got him all in the shot now. So we've got about 2 minutes to finish off that rather beautiful drawing of a green woodpecker you're working on, after which we'll move on to our 10-minute challenge. Let's say, don't worry if you don't finish this tonight. You can revisit it again on YouTube if you want to get a bit more detail in it. Okay, now it's time for our 10-minute challenge, and this one is a rather nice composition because it gives you a bit of a contrast. We've got a barn owl, which is our taxidermy specimen, and a rather wonderful barn owl skeleton as well, which shows you just how delicate these animals are inside and how different they look inside to what you see on the outside. Do keep your questions coming in. These are rather beautiful questions. I'm really hoping I can answer some of these, actually. Really great questions. And Laura's going to put them to me at the end. We're just lighting our skeleton to get it just right for your drawing so you can have a little rest. And here it is, a beautiful barn owl and the barn owl skeleton. And you have 10 minutes to get a nice bit of detail into your drawings with this one. and we're just coming up to the halfway mark, and you've got another 5 minutes to work on those rather beautiful specimens. Okay, and that's the end of our 10-minute sketch. We're now going to move over to our finale, and these are rather beautiful specimens. You'll have to bear with us while we swap our lighting around and adjust the specimens for just a few seconds. During which, I can say that if you want to listen to this track of birdsong by Harcourt or Arboretum, you can do that just by googling Harcourt Arboretum and Dawn Chorus, and that will come up for you. And you can listen to this. It's about an hour long. You can listen to this anytime you feel like surrounding yourself with these marvelous sounds. So our last pose. I was very lucky to be allowed by Mark Carnell, our collections manager, into the bird room behind the scenes, which is absolutely stuffed full of the most incredible specimens. I found it so hard to choose something that I thought was both beautiful and a challenge, and quite frankly, I would have left the room with armfuls if I possibly could. But these are three of some of my favourite groups of birds, because I grew up with one for most of my life. These are parrots. We have a superb parrot, which is an Australian parrot that eats eucalyptus flowers, pollen, and the seeds of yellow box. We have a scaly-breasted lorikeet, which is an Australian bird, which it's one of the parrots that, as I said, has this lovely bristle-like shaving brush structure of keratin on the tip of its beak, and uses that just for feeding on nectar and pollen. And then we have one of the largest parrots, the blue-throated macaw, which is endemic to a small area of Bolivia. And unfortunately, there are only about 300 to 400 of these birds left in the wild. They are critically endangered, and they eat fruit from large palm trees. There is, however, a captive population of 1,000 to 1,500 in zoos around the world, and again, this touches on the fact that if we want to conserve these things, these captive breeding groups in zoos are doing a fantastic job in keeping that gene pool alive to enable us to reintroduce birds into the wild, and if we have the habitats, to boost their populations. So, as I said, you're going to have about 15 minutes to do this, and we're just setting up the specimens now, during which Laura will ask me your fantastic questions, and there are some brilliant questions coming in. So I hope you've managed to turn over your paper, and possibly had a sip of a nice glass of something sitting next to you, or maybe a sip of that tea to keep you going. But we're just about ready to go over to our final pose, these three rather marvellous parrots. And I think we're just getting the focus on them. I've had some amazing questions come in the meantime. Agnes asked, is there more bone in owl than feathers? Do you know what? I don't know. By area, certainly there's more feathers than bone, but by weight, I'm not sure. I think you'd have to do an experiment. But here are rather wonderful birds. So these are these three parrots, and you have 15 minutes to draw these rather beautiful specimens. And while you're doing that, I think Laura has some of your questions ready for me. So I better put myself in the hot seat again and turn my camera on and see just how many I can answer, because as I said, I'm no expert. I am a hardened amateur naturalist. I just like birds a lot, so I've done a bit of reading on them. So Laura, do we have any questions?
Yes, hello, Chris. Thank you for filling in while we've just been getting these gorgeous parrots set up. So lots of interesting questions about the kind of mouth and beak area of the birds.
Very important area.
Zoe asks, do birds have nostrils, and if so, what are they used for? And Amy asks whether birds still have taste buds, given that their tongues have been so highly adaptive.
Yeah, really good questions. Actually, birds do have nostrils, and they're used obviously for breathing. And birds like penguins can actually expel air at vast speeds through their nostrils when they surface. But they are used for smell as well. And I wish I could remember the source of a paper I read a few years ago. But apparently somebody did some experimentation on their sense of smell by basically spraying the smell of predators around a bird's nest and watching their reaction as they flew in. And I think it was essence of weasel they used, and they sprayed this around a bird's nest, and the birds actively, actively avoided it on coming close to it. It took them much longer to land on their eggs. So they certainly do have a sense of smell. As to taste buds, it really does depend on what the bird eats. So birds that tend to eat a single food source tend to have very limited numbers of taste buds on their tongues, whereas some of these birds that eat a wide variety of foods. I mean, some of the parrots, for example, that are very eclectic in the foods they eat. They tend to have a much wider range of taste buds. So they do have taste buds, but it varies from species to species according to what they eat. If you want to know more about birds' sense of taste or smell or sight, there is a wonderful book I can recommend to you, which is Tim Birkhead's Bird Sense. Tim Birkhead is an amazing ornithologist, and it's a very well researched book. So do look that up if you want to know more about birds' senses. So I think that's all I can say about birds' smell and their sense of taste.
Well, I personally wouldn't really fancy an essence of weasel, either smell or taste. Fantastic, thank you, Chris. And Annie asked about the Archaeopteryx feather that you showed us during your talk. So that one feather that showed that it was that in the shape showed that it was a flight feather. She wonders how it was so well preserved, and what conditions were required to preserve it in that way.
Well, it is fantastically preserved, and just like shortly before volcanic eruptions, were very quickly covered in this incredibly finely grained sediment, which has preserved, every single sort of detail of their feathers, down to the point where you can actually, start to work out the colours of some of these feathers as well. So they were both sites of exceptional preservation and sites that should be preserved as geo-heritage sites. I think both sites now are. So protected for generations to come.
Yeah, okay. And Stephanie, on the subject of feathers also, and in fact fossil feathers, she would like to know how you can tell what colour the feathers were from the fossils that we found.
Oh, this is a great new breakthrough in paleontology. So somebody compared the structures of proteins on fossil feathers with the structure of proteins on living bird feathers. And they noticed that the structures that give them pigment occur in several forms. So the structures are called melanosomes. And where they're clumped together, these protein structures are clumped together, they actually form black colours. Where they're long and thin, on birds today, they produce a reddish, variety of reddish and brown colours. And where they're formed as sort of plates that overlap, they produce iridescence. So with some of these exceptionally preserved fossils, what scientists can do is they can actually put these fossils under scanning electron microscopes and into things like the diamond light source here in Oxfordshire, and they can actually work out what the colours are. So we're beginning to get some picture of actually, these beautifully coloured dinosaurs, things like that illustration of Kai Hong, which was covered in iridescent feathers. I think Archaeopteryx, I think that feather has recently been analysed, and I think it's black. So we may well have to change and update the model we have on display in the court. So that's a very good question.
Oh, well, let's not tell our collections team that they're going to have to change the model just yet. Hope none of them are watching. Wonderful. So Carol asks whether there's any evidence of climatic changes which might have kick-started the development of feathers for thermoregulation.
Well, it depends when feathers actually first evolved. I mean, if they did evolve in the very early Triassic, after the Permian mass extinction, and it was the ancestors' feathers evolved. However, it's worth remembering that even today, the difference between night and day in a temperate climate, or even greater in a desert, is quite remarkable. And reptiles do find it difficult to regulate their temperature and keep themselves from overheating or getting too cold. So anything that actually insulated them or allowed them to regulate their temperature in even normal climatic times would be a great advantage and save a lot of energy being expended on keeping warm or keeping cool by that animal. So nature would select, I think, for it in sort of even under normal climatic conditions. But a great question. I really must read more about when the feathers evolved and try and see if anybody's done any work on sort of climatic changes and the evolution of feathers, because that would be a really interesting area to explore.
Yeah, and talking of exploring, it's really great to hear from you about the reintroduction of cranes and storks. So we're kind of exploring ways of bringing back species. And actually, I once saw a stork flying over the museum, and I couldn't believe it, but it cannot have been anything else. So, but actually, what I was looking for then, when I was looking up at the sky on the lawn of the museum, were swifts. So Chris, I wonder if you might want to just tell us, finish off by telling us about what you might have spotted this morning.
I will do, and I remember the day you saw that stork, and I was so jealous because I was sitting in my office when you saw it. And they are unmistakable. Yeah, I mean, one of the bits of news from this morning is every year we await the return of our colony of swifts to the tower. It's one of the longest running continuous studies of any bird colony in the world. It started in 1947 by David Lack, and every year we've been, or scientists, I think the scientists have been measuring the population. The only time they land, the only thing they can't do, obviously, is lay their eggs in the air. So they fly something like 14,000 miles a year. They leave our tower, they fly all the way to southern Africa for the summer down there to feed on the insects down there, and then they fly back. Sort of the total journey in its shortest form is 14,000 miles, not to count all the flying they do in between, and then they land and they lay their eggs. And we're lucky enough to have a colony in the tower. And this morning, their average date of arrival is the 5th of May. But I start getting twitchy about the end of April and start thinking, oh, it's summer coming. When are the swifts coming? Because I was marked summer coming by seeing the swifts. And I walked out this morning, and after a very wet weekend, having been told they'd been seen feeding over Farmore Reservoir nearby, I walked out and looked up, and there were 2 swifts screaming past our tower, checking out our nest boxes. I did immediately go in and start to write a blog to alert people to the fact that you can see our swifts in the tower on our nest cams, and you can follow the whole breeding season up there. And in the half hour it took me writing that blog, I then rushed out, and they'd been joined by another 3 swifts, so we had 5 zipping around the tower. So if you want to know anything more about swifts, which as I say, it's incredible, the fastest bird in level flight, birds that can sleep as they fly. If you want to know anything about those, do have a look on our website, and do look at our Swift's diary and our Swift pages, because you'll be able to watch them on the webcam, but you'll be able to watch how our study goes this year, but also look at all the data going back to the 70s of each year of monitoring the population, and see how it fluctuates in terms of weather and all sorts of things like that. But yeah, one of my favourite birds, because they mean summer, and yeah, glad to have them back.
Yeah, it certainly is a sign of summer at the museum, isn't it, when the swifts start to scream around the place. It may be freezing outside, but the swifts know something different. Thank you so much, Chris, for your talk tonight, and for answering those questions, and for just being such a fountain of knowledge about birds, and bird anatomy and bird smell and everything else. So it's really wonderful to have you talking with us, and talking for a change rather than introducing. So thanks enormously. Just a couple of forthcoming events to draw people's attention to. So our next Drawn to Nature event will be on minerals. So from kind of soft, fluffy feathers to hard, shiny minerals. So that's going to be on the 19th of May, and we're very much looking forward to that. There's details on the website about that, and also in your joining instructions email that you will have received today. And before that, Professor Dave Goulson will be coming to give a talk on Tuesday, the 11th of May. So again, an online event, and he's a specialist in bee ecology, and he'll be talking about saving our insects and what we can do practically with our green spaces to encourage more insect life and greater biodiversity in the insect population. So we're very excited about both of those events, and we really hope that you will be able to join us there. Thank you again, Chris, for a really informative and fascinating talk. And we look forward to seeing what you've come up with. Do tag us in any posts that you make about your drawings. We are at More Than a Dodo. We love seeing what you come up with. So have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Good night.